Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Injury Law Pod. I am your host, Eric Bartlett, 28-year personal injury lawyer, and this is the podcast where we discuss all things personal injury law related. Up today, we're talking marijuana. And when I say that around my teenagers, they make fun of me. Dad, just call it weed. Well, whatever you call it, weed, ganja, devil's lettuce. We are talking about the drug officially known as marijuana, and specifically the legalization of marijuana in the state of Missouri and how it relates to driving impairment and what we're seeing in Missouri and other interesting data surrounding this topic. So obviously, Missouri legalized marijuana as of December of 2022. And that legalization allowed adults age 21 or over to possess up to 3 ounces of marijuana, purchase up to 3 ounces per transaction from a licensed dispensary, cultivate up to 6 flowering plants, 6 immature plants, and 6 plants under 14 inches for personal use, provided they obtain a non-commercial cultivation registration permit. Now, of note, the law specifically prohibits consumption of marijuana in public places. And I don't know about you, but I certainly see a lot of consumption in public, or better yet, I smell it. And I mean, it's pretty fascinating to me. Middle of the day, I have a balcony here at my office. I go out there and the aroma of marijuana oftentimes is in the air. And so it's obviously become a much more open experience for many. Even though the law prohibits it being in public, I think people are just now feeling more comfortable smoking marijuana. So on this episode, we're going to look at the science behind marijuana-impaired driving and how it differs from alcohol-impaired driving. We're going to look at some of Missouri's statistics related to drug-impaired driving. And we're going to discuss some of the legal implications, considerations, and challenges in Missouri with the implementation of the marijuana law and kind of what it looks like for police officers to figure out if somebody is driving under the influence of drugs as opposed to alcohol. So first things first, let's talk a little bit about the science behind marijuana impaired driving. So THC, which is the active component in marijuana, the drug part of it, and THC stands for a really long scientific name that I'm not even going to bother trying to pronounce. This active component in marijuana is what affects cognitive and motor functions. And that leads to impaired judgment, delayed reaction times, and decreased motor coordination. And it's different from alcohol because while both marijuana and alcohol impair your driving ability, they do so in very distinct ways due to their effects on the brain and your body. And so understanding these differences is crucial for recognizing how each substance affects motor skills, judgment, and reaction times. So with alcohol, it depresses the central nervous system, it reduces coordination, it slows reaction time, it impairs judgment, and decreases the ability to track moving objects. Whereas marijuana affects the cognitive function by altering your perception, reducing attention span, it impairs your short-term memory, and it also slows reaction time. But unlike alcohol, it can sometimes cause overcompensation. where users try to drive more cautiously, but they still exhibit impaired coordination. So with alcohol, you have a delayed reaction time, a significantly delayed reaction time. It reduces your muscle coordination. It makes it harder for you to respond quickly to traffic changes. And with marijuana, it slows your reaction time, but users often perceive the impairment and they try to compensate by driving more slowly or increasing their following distance. And this doesn't eliminate the impairment, right? This is just their overcompensation for it. And I think we've seen that in movies and other jokes where it's the really slow rolling vehicle that then when the windows are rolled down, huge amounts of smoke come out, and it's implied that the driver's very high and driving really slow to try to compensate for their delayed reaction time and other impairment. Alcohol increases risk taking and it makes drivers more likely to speed, ignore traffic signals, or engage in other reckless behavior, which not only goes for just driving, but in general, right? That's what alcohol does. It lowers inhibition. Now, marijuana tends to make drivers more cautious, but it impairs their ability to maintain lane position, judge distances, and react appropriately to sudden changes. So even though they're not really less inhibited and more likely to do reckless stuff, it's actually kind of the opposite. The problem is their brain function is affected and they don't have the reaction time, the coordination, and all of those things that are obviously needed to operate a motor vehicle. Now, alcohol severely affects your judgment and it makes individuals unaware of their impairment and more likely to drive under the influence. And whereas marijuana impairs multitasking and depth perception, but it usually makes users aware of their impairment, leading them to drive more conservatively. But again, it doesn't mean it's safer. It just means they're overcompensating for their impairment. Now, if you combine marijuana and alcohol, then you've got a really bad situation. When marijuana and alcohol are used together, impairment is significantly more dangerous than using either substance alone. The combination multiplies impairment effects. It increases drowsiness, it reduces the reaction time even further, and it amplifies poor judgment. Clearly, those two things together, you should not ever be behind the wheel of a vehicle, let alone individually. So it's kind of interesting because we have these two drugs and they kind of affect people differently. They impair people differently, but they essentially lead to the same danger. That's what a lot of people don't appreciate. A lot of marijuana users believe that, unlike if they've been drinking, they feel like they can get behind the wheel of a vehicle and operate it pretty safely. But again, both substances impair driving, and again, just in different way. Essentially, alcohol leads to the riskier behavior, overconfidence, and loss of coordination, whereas marijuana slows your reaction time, impairs judgment, and it affects your attention span. Now, some Missouri-specific statistics with regards to drug-impaired driving. As of 2023, it was noted that drug-impaired driving contributed to 7% of all 2023 Missouri traffic fatalities, so traffic deaths. Now, again, we also know some of this stuff depends on how it's reported, things like that. So this is everybody's best knowledge on the subject. There were 73 people killed and 167 seriously injured in crashes in 2023 involving at least one drug-impaired driver. There's been a 24% increase in Missouri drug-impaired fatalities over the last 10 years. And again, does that correlate? I mean, that's a long span, right? Over 10 years. But of course, the legalization has come in the last few years. And so the question is the legalization, the more open use of marijuana, leading to more impaired drivers under the influence of marijuana and then leading to more accidents? So, what everybody has to know is that Missouri's DWI laws, which is driving while intoxicated, this includes impairment from alcohol, controlled substances, or drugs. So marijuana fits within the Missouri driving while intoxicated law. And, despite the fact that marijuana has been legalized, driving under its influence remains illegal. And everybody needs to know that if they don't already. Now, it's interesting because it's harder for law enforcement to detect impairment by marijuana. So unlike alcohol, where there's a clearly defined standard, 0.08% blood alcohol concentration, that serves as the legal threshold for intoxication. There's no universally accepted THC impairment level that reliably determines when a person is too impaired to drive. And the reasons behind that are, number one, THC affects individuals differently. Unlike alcohol, where impairment correlates relatively consistently with blood alcohol content, THC's effects vary widely based on tolerance, frequency of use, metabolism, and individual body chemistry. And a regular cannabis user may have a higher THC level in their blood, but less impairment than an occasional user with lower THC levels. THC also stays in the body longer. And so while alcohol leaves the body within hours, THC can remain detectable in blood or urine for days or weeks, and even when a person is no longer impaired. This makes it difficult to determine whether THC presence in the bloodstream is an indicator of actual impairment at the time of driving. There's also another aspect to all of this, in that there's an active component of THC and a non-active component of THC. And the active component of THC is what produces the impairment, and the non-active component is what sticks around. And quite a few years ago, my law firm was involved in a personal injury wrongful death claim where we were claiming that the at-fault driver who had killed our client's husband, part of the claim was that he was under the influence of marijuana or THC at the time of the accident. And I learned a lot at that time about marijuana, THC, the drug component of all of it. And it's definitely debatable as to whether from a blood sample you can really get anything defining out of it as far as impairment. And I'll leave it at that, but we had experts, and of course we had an expert that said, based on what he saw in the blood, he could extrapolate that the driver was impaired. The other side had an expert who said that conclusion could not be made with what was seen in the blood. So again, there is no sure shot blood work or urinalysis that can tell you definitively if somebody is impaired like there is in alcohol. Some states have actually set legal THC limits for driving. Now, having just said what I said, it is kind of interesting that Colorado and Washington, which, Colorado, they've had legalized marijuana for a long time. So they have actually put into place a threshold, if you will, of 5 nanograms per milliliter of THC in blood. And again, what's interesting about this is there's no scientific consensus that this amount accurately indicates impairment. But if you're in Colorado or you're in Washington and they draw blood and you have more than 5 nanograms per milliliter of THC in your blood and you were pulled over operating a vehicle, there's going to be a presumption that you were operating under the influence of marijuana. But Missouri, like most states, has no per se THC limit, and it instead relies on what most of the states rely on, which is behavioral signs of impairment during traffic stops. So, what does that look like? How does that work? Well, there are police officers that are specifically trained as drug recognition experts, DREs, and that is what Missouri uses. And so basically, because of the lack of a clear THC impairment standard, Missouri law enforcement relies on these DREs to determine whether a driver's under the influence of marijuana or other drugs. So it's always interesting if for some reason you get pulled over and you are being put through drug recognition tests and you are subsequently arrested based on those tests. The question is, right, was this officer an officially trained DRE? But what they basically do is a 12-step evaluation process to assess impairment. And this includes observing eye movements, coordination and behavior, checking pupil dilation and vital signs, conducting divided attention tests. So similar to field sobriety tests for alcohol. They evaluate speech patterns, muscle tone, and cognitive function. And they can also conduct toxicology tests, blood, saliva, or urine if needed. Again, we've already discussed that there's no great usefulness for that in Missouri, but I'm not saying it can't happen. Now, in Missouri, there's a limited availability of DREs. This brings me back to my earlier point. So if for some reason you're pulled over and you're run through tests and you're subsequently arrested, that's certainly something a lawyer is going to want to look at. And again, remember, you should never, ever, absolutely, positively, never even think about getting behind the wheel if you've been smoking marijuana or driving or drinking. So just keep that in mind. That's the purpose of this podcast today. Because unfortunately, in my world, I see too many accidents happening because of impaired driving and people getting hurt and people getting killed. But having said that, less than half the police agencies in Missouri have a certified DRE. And that means many impaired drivers may not be properly evaluated if an officer without DRE training pulls them over. Now, again, it can go both ways, right? Because again, they're probably missing a lot of impaired drivers as well. There is subjectivity in these evaluations because unlike a BAC test where you get that blood marker, which gives a clear numerical result, DRE assessments rely heavily on officer observation and judgment, their training, all those things, and that can lead to inconsistent enforcement. But because THC impairment lacks a standardized measurement, Missouri relies on these DRE officers to determine drug-impaired driving. And again, with only fewer than half of the state's police agencies having a DRE, many cases depend on basic field sobriety tests and officer discretion, and that makes enforcement more challenging compared to alcohol-related DUIs. Now in Missouri, penalty-wise, for marijuana-impaired driving, it's first-time DWI offense is a Class B misdemeanor. It's punishable by up to 6 months in jail, a $1,000 fine, and a 30-day license suspension. Of course, it becomes more severe if you have repeat offenses. And of course, God forbid, you cause an accident and hurt somebody or kill somebody, that's a whole different level of criminal penalties and also civil penalties potentially at that point. Somebody making a personal injury claim against you. So in Missouri, there are some prevention and public safety measures underway. Number one, of course, there's just the continual public announcements that you should take public transportation. You should designate a sober driver. You should utilize ride sharing services, or you should stay home when you're smoking marijuana or using marijuana, whether it's edible form or otherwise. Again, today we have so many options for getting around, being transported around. There's simply no excuse if you are using marijuana to get behind the wheel of a car. There's just too many other options out there with all the technology that we have. So please keep that in mind. And then as far as law enforcement initiatives, Missouri has a 420 drug-impaired driving enforcement campaign. And it's an annual initiative. It's aimed at reducing drug-impaired driving incidents through heightened enforcement and public awareness, particularly around April 20th, 420. It's a date associated with increased cannabis consumption. You, again, if you're into marijuana, you're probably familiar with 420 Day. But this campaign typically spans from, say, mid-March to late April. And for example, in 2024, the campaign ran from March 15th to April 21st. And during this period, law enforcement agencies across Missouri, they intensify their efforts to identify and apprehend drug-impaired drivers. And this includes increased patrols and sobriety checkpoints. There's also a public awareness campaign that goes along with it. The campaign emphasizes educating the public on the dangers and legal consequences of drug-impaired driving. Slogans like, "If you feel different, you drive different," are used to highlight that impairment from drugs, including marijuana, can adversely affect driving abilities. And according to SaveMoLives.com, which you can go to check out more information on all of this. I should point out that young drivers are notably affected in all of this. In 2023, drug-impaired drivers under the age of 21, so again, they're not even legal to be smoking marijuana in the first place. But anyway, they were involved in 5 fatal and 13 serious injury crashes, resulting in 8 fatalities and 22 serious injuries. Can you imagine how life-changing that is for everybody involved? You have these young people who thought they could drive, could handle it, and here they are. They've just either seriously injured somebody or taken somebody's life. And that's what you have to remember when you're thinking about getting behind the wheel if you've been smoking marijuana. In an instant, everything can change for all kinds of people, not just yourself. So it's interesting because the 420 drug-impaired driving enforcement campaign, it just underscores Missouri's commitment to combating drug-impaired driving. Look, Missouri said, okay, we're cool with you using marijuana, right? I mean, I think pretty much all the states have given up the fight. You can use it, you're over 21, here's the parameters, but you just can't drive under the influence of marijuana. And so Missouri has taken this proactive law enforcement and public education stance, and they're aiming to enhance road safety for all residents. There's also other public awareness efforts out there. For example, Missouri Coalition for Roadway Safety, they've done a campaign aimed at educating the public on the dangers of impaired driving. So there's a lot of different campaigns out there trying to get the word out. And again, that's what I'm trying to do with this podcast today. get the word out that there's just no future in driving if you've been using marijuana. So just as a recap, there is no great way for law enforcement to analyze somebody and charge them with driving under the influence of marijuana, but there are ways, and they will do it. And it largely comes down to observation and various testing on the roadside. And again, key giveaways for police officers: if they see a vehicle driving in an overly cautious manner, but yet exhibiting some of those lane departure maneuvers, things like that, they're going to pull that person over and they're going to investigate further. But again, there's so many options today that you do not have to get behind the wheel of a vehicle if you've been using marijuana. And so just, have your Uber lined up, have your buddy lined up, whatever that looks like, to get you where you want to go. And just don't even risk it. Why even risk it? It's not worth it. And, just be careful out there and be safe on the roadways. We see it all the time where somebody under the influence of some drug or alcohol causes serious injury, causes death. It's devastating for all parties involved, and it's life altering. And so you just don't want to be in those statistics. And as always, I hope you found this podcast useful, informational. I did do a podcast about marijuana and drugs and how they interact in the work comp system. And so if you want to learn more about that area of the law, I'd encourage you click on the video above and you can check that out. And until next time, be safe, be well.